The unluckiest girl agreed to date the most hated man in town on Christmas night, but the end left everyone stunned. Welcome, my beautiful family. Merry Christmas to everyone. I hope you're all enjoying the holiday season. If you've been enjoying our stories, don't forget to drop a yes in the comments. And of course, share with us which year you are celebrating this Christmas. Whether it's your first, fifth, or 10th, we'd love to hear about it. Let's spread the holiday cheer together. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets of Millbrook like a persistent memory, wrapping around the ankles of hurrying pedestrians who quickened their pace as a black Mercedes approached. Behind the wheel, Nolan Miles watched with bitter satisfaction as people scattered before him, their whispered conversations dying mid-sentence. His reputation preceded him like a dark cloud, and he had grown accustomed to the way mothers pulled their children closer when he passed, how shopkeepers suddenly became busy with inventory when he entered their stores. At 32, Nolan had already accumulated more wealth than most would see in a lifetime. His investment firm, housed in the renovated Victorian mansion at 23 Highland Street, had made him a fortune that the small-town residents could only dream of. The building itself stood as a testament to his isolation, a Gothic giant looming over the town, its wrought-iron gates always firmly closed. "There goes Terrible again," whispered Marion Foster to her friend as they stood outside the local cafe. She didn't bother lowering her voice. Everyone knew Nolan Miles couldn't care less what they thought of him. "Did you hear what he did to poor Thomas at the bank?" The story had spread through town like wildfire. Thomas Green, a junior loan officer, had made the mistake of questioning one of Nolan's business transactions. The resulting verbal assault had left the young man in tears, and the bank manager scrambling to smooth things over. It wasn't the money that concerned Nolan. It was the principle. Nobody questioned him, not anymore. Inside his office, Nolan settled into his leather chair, its soft creak a familiar comfort in his self-imposed solitude. The wall-to-wall windows offered a panoramic view of the town below, but his eyes were drawn to the framed photograph he kept face down in his desk drawer. He hadn't looked at it in years, but he knew every detail by heart. A younger version of himself, smiling genuinely, his arm around a beautiful woman with honey blonde hair and eyes that held secrets he'd been too blind to see. "Mr. Miles!" His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, hesitant as always. "The board members are waiting in the conference room." "Let them wait," he replied, his voice carrying the edge that had become his trademark. He took pleasure in their discomfort, these men in their expensive suits who'd once looked down on him. Now they jumped at his command, their earlier condescension replaced by fear-tinged respect. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, each interaction reinforcing the walls he'd built around himself. His employees moved through the office like ghosts, speaking in whispers and avoiding eye contact. Only Ms. Harrison, his 65-year-old executive assistant, dared to address him directly. Perhaps it was her age, or the fact that she'd known him before everything changed. "You have a letter," she announced, placing a cream-colored envelope on his desk. "From the hospital board." Nolan's jaw tightened. The hospital board had been trying to secure a meeting with him for weeks, hoping to convince him to donate to their new wing. Money. It always came down to money. People only approached him when they wanted something from him. The letter contained the usual platitudes about community responsibility and legacy building, but one detail caught his eye. They weren't just asking for money. They wanted him to host a Christmas Eve gathering for the hospital's major donors. The irony wasn't lost on him. Christmas Eve, the anniversary of the night that had transformed him from a lovesick fool into the man the town now feared. Standing at his window, Nolan watched as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town square. Below, people hurried about their holiday shopping, their breath visible in the December air. Families walked together, friends met for coffee, couples strolled hand in hand, all of them part of a world he'd long since left behind. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. Immaculate black suit, perfectly styled dark hair, features that magazines had once described as handsome before his perpetual scowl had become his defining characteristic. Success had given him everything he'd thought he wanted: power, respect, independence. But standing alone in his tower of achievement, he couldn't ignore the hollow echo of his footsteps in empty hallways. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Miles, Dr. Williams from the hospital board is on line 1. She's quite insistent." Nolan's hand hovered over the phone. He could easily ignore the call, as he had so many others. The town's opinion of him couldn't get much worse, and yet something made him pause. Perhaps it was the date on the calendar, or the weight of memories that always grew heavier as Christmas approached, but for the first time in years he felt a crack in his carefully constructed armor. "Put her through," he said finally, his voice carrying a weariness he rarely allowed others to hear. As he waited for the connection, his eyes fell on the business section of the morning's newspaper, where his own scowling face stared back at him beneath the headline, "Miles Investments Continues Aggressive Expansion." The article painted him as a ruthless business genius, a man to be admired and feared in equal measure. What would they write, he wondered, if they knew the truth? If they knew about the naive young man who'd once believed in love, who'd given his heart so completely only to have it shattered on a Christmas Eve, much like the one approaching? Would they understand, then, why he'd chosen to become the monster they already believed him to be? The phone line clicked, and Nolan straightened in his chair, his mask of indifference sliding back into place. But as he prepared to deliver his usual curt dismissal, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The carefully ordered world he'd built around his pain was about to be disrupted, and not even the most feared man in Millbrook could stop what was coming. Little did he know, across town in the hospital's busy halls, a young nurse named Lawrence Blacksmith was about to receive an assignment that would change both their lives forever. The wheels of fate had begun to turn, and the man everyone feared was about to meet the one person who could see through his carefully constructed facade to the wounded heart beneath. Chapter 2. The Girl Nobody Understood. The fluorescent lights of Millbrook General Hospital cast harsh shadows across Lawrence Blacksmith's face as she made her early morning rounds. At 27, she moved through the quiet halls with a grace that belied her reputation for misfortune, her dark skin contrasting with the sterile white of her nurse's uniform. The night shift was ending, but for Lawrence, the real work was just beginning. "Morning, Lawrence," mumbled Nancy, the head nurse, barely glancing up from her charts. The slight hesitation before her name didn't go unnoticed. It never did. 7 months at Millbrook General, and still her colleagues treated her like a bomb waiting to explode, their superstitions about her bad luck creating an invisible barrier that no amount of kindness seemed able to breach. Lawrence pulled her long braids back into a neat bun, checking her reflection in the break room window. Dark circles rimmed her eyes, testament to another night spent tossing and turning in her small apartment above Mason's bookstore. The dreams had returned, memories of rain-soaked streets and empty stomachs, of doors closing in her face as a 14-year-old girl begged for shelter. "There's been a change in your rotation," Nancy announced, finally looking up. "Mrs. Peterson in 302 specifically requested..." Well, she requested someone else. The older nurse had the decency to look embarrassed. "I'm moving you to the private wing today." Lawrence's hands stilled on her coffee cup. The private wing meant wealthy patients, people who would take one look at her and assume the worst. She'd seen it before, the way their eyes would narrow, how they'd clutch their belongings closer when she entered the room. But she straightened her shoulders, refusing to let the familiar ache of rejection show on her face. Of course, she replied, her voice carrying the quiet dignity that had become her armor. I'll head there now. The private wing gleamed with expensive furnishings and artwork, a far cry from the utilitarian halls of the general wards. As Lawrence reviewed her new patient files, a conversation from the nurse's station drifted her way. "Did you hear? Nolan Miles is finally responding to the board's requests," one voice whispered excitedly. "Apparently, he's considering hosting the Christmas Eve fundraiser." "Terrible Miles. Heaven help whoever has to deal with him," another nurse responded. "Remember what happened to Jessica when she tried to take his blood pressure last month?" Lawrence absorbed the gossip silently, her mind drifting to her own encounters with prejudice. In a way, she understood what it meant to be feared, to have people make assumptions based on nothing but surface appearances and whispered rumors. The memory of her first day in Millbrook surfaced unbidden. She'd arrived on a Greyhound bus with nothing but a backpack and a nursing degree earned through years of night classes and double shifts. The town had seemed picture-perfect then, all historic buildings and tree-lined streets. But beneath its charming exterior lay the same prejudices she'd faced her entire life. Her tiny apartment had been the only one available, the landlord's reluctance obvious in his tight-lipped smile as he handed over the keys. "It's just that we've had some incidents with your kind before," he'd said, not quite meeting her eyes. Lawrence had taken the keys without comment, having learned long ago that some battles weren't worth fighting. As she moved through her morning duties, Lawrence allowed herself to remember the path that had led her here. The death of her mother when she was just 6, leaving a void that her father's new wife had filled with cruelty, the endless hours of housework, the accidents that always seemed to happen around her, the whispered accusations of witchcraft that her stepmother spread through their community. Then came the night of her father's funeral. She could still feel the rain soaking through her threadbare dress as her stepmother changed the locks, could still hear the woman's voice. "Your bad luck killed him. I won't let it destroy what's left of this family." 14 years old, alone on streets that held no mercy for a young girl with dark skin and empty pockets. But Lawrence had survived. More than that, she'd fought her way through night school, worked every job she could find, and somehow managed to keep her heart open despite everything the world had thrown at her. "Nurse Blacksmith." A timid voice interrupted her memories. Martha, one of the younger nurses, stood clutching a file to her chest. "There's been another incident in the children's ward. The therapy dog started barking as soon as you walked past earlier, and now some of the parents are complaining." Lawrence accepted the news with a small nod, her face betraying none of the hurt that bloomed in her chest. It was always something. A dropped tray, a malfunctioning equipment, a scared animal. No matter how hard she tried to help, misfortune seemed to follow in her wake. But then there were moments that made it all worthwhile. Like last week, when little Tommy Anderson, terminal with leukemia, had grabbed her hand and whispered, "You feel safe, like my mommy." His mother had requested a different nurse the next day, but for that one moment, Lawrence had felt seen for who she truly was. During her lunch break, eaten alone in the hospital's small garden, Lawrence pulled out her worn journal. Its pages held her dreams, sketched out in careful handwriting, dreams of opening a clinic for underprivileged children, of creating a place where no one would be turned away because of their appearance or circumstances. Dreams that seemed as distant as the stars she'd wished on during those long-ago nights on the streets. The afternoon brought a new challenge, an assignment to the hospital's most prestigious private room. As she reviewed the patient's file, her heart sank. The name at the top read, "Miles Nolan, Annual Physical." The most feared man in Millbrook would be her patient, and if the rumors were true, he made Mrs. Peterson look like a saint. Standing before the mirror in the staff bathroom, Lawrence squared her shoulders. She had survived homelessness, prejudice, and countless setbacks. She had earned her place here, regardless of what anyone thought. Whatever cruel words or suspicious glances awaited her in that examination room, she would face them with the same quiet strength that had carried her this far. As she gathered her supplies, Lorenz couldn't know that this encounter would be different, that the man everyone feared and the girl nobody understood were about to recognize in each other something that the rest of the world had missed. Two souls wrapped in protective armor, waiting for someone brave enough to see past the surface to the truth beneath. The clock struck 2, and Lorenz took a deep breath, stepping toward the private wing. Sometimes the greatest changes come disguised as ordinary moments, and the most powerful connections begin in the last place we expect to find them. For Lorenz Blacksmith, that moment was about to arrive, wrapped in the sterile confines of a hospital examination room, where two of Millbrook's most misunderstood residents were about to meet. Chapter 3. A Christmas Eve Meeting. Snow fell in gentle swirls outside the windows of Miles' mansion, each flake catching the golden light from the crystal chandeliers within. The great house, usually shrouded in darkness, blazed with warmth on this Christmas Eve. Inside, Millbrook's elite mingled nervously, their forced laughter echoing off marble floors as they cast wary glances at their host. Nolan Miles stood beside the grand fireplace, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand. His black suit, impeccably tailored, set him apart from the festive reds and greens worn by his guests. The hospital board members had been shocked when he'd agreed to host the fundraiser, but they'd been even more surprised by his one condition, that the entire hospital staff be invited, not just the administrators and doctors. In the kitchen, Lorenz Blacksmith smoothed her simple burgundy dress, wondering for the 100th time why she'd accepted the invitation. The other nurses had tried to warn her off. Nothing good ever comes from getting close to terrible Miles. But something about his demeanor during that physical exam 2 weeks ago had sparked her curiosity. "You don't have to be afraid," he had said then, noticing her trembling hands as she took his blood pressure. His voice had been different, softer, almost vulnerable. "I know what they say about me, just like I know what they say about you." Now, gathering her courage, Lorenz stepped into the grand hallway. The crowd parted before her like water, whispers following in her wake. She'd grown used to this reaction, but tonight it stung more than usual. Christmas had always been the hardest time of year, bringing back memories of her last holiday with her father, before everything fell apart. "Nurse Blacksmith." Nolan's deep voice cut through her thoughts. He stood before her, his usual scowl replaced by something more complex. "You came, Mr. Miles." She met his gaze steadily, remembering how his eyes had softened momentarily during their last encounter. "Thank you for the invitation." "Follow me," he said abruptly, turning toward a smaller doorway off the main hall. Lorenz hesitated only briefly before following. The whispers grew louder, but she ignored them, focusing instead on the straight line of Nolan's shoulders, the slight tension in his stride. He led her to a cozy study, where a smaller fire crackled in an ornate fireplace. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings gleaming in the warm light. It was a room that spoke of solitude rather than loneliness, of chosen isolation rather than forced exile. "You must be wondering why I invited you here." Nolan gestured to a comfortable armchair, taking the one opposite. "Why I insisted the entire staff be included." Lorenz settled into the chair, noting how the firelight softened his features. "I assumed it was for appearances. The hospital board must be thrilled to have your support." A bitter laugh escaped him. "Appearances? Yes, this whole town runs on appearances, doesn't it? They see what they expect to see, the terrible rich man, the unlucky nurse. It's easier than looking deeper." "Is that why you maintain your reputation?" Lorenz asked quietly. "To keep them from looking deeper?" Silence stretched between them. filled only by the crackling of the fire and the muffled sounds of the party beyond the study doors. Nolan studied his glass as if the amber liquid might hold the answers he sought. There was another Christmas Eve party, he began slowly. 7 years ago, I was different then, younger, more foolish. His knuckles whitened around the glass. I learned the hard way that people only get close to you when they want something. Lawrence felt an unexpected kinship with the pain in his voice. Not everyone, she said softly. Some of us know what it's like to be judged before we've spoken a word, to have others decide our worth based on their own fears and prejudices. Nolan's eyes met hers, recognition flickering in their depths. The day of the physical, he said, you were the first person in years who didn't flinch when I walked into the room. And you were the first person who didn't blame me when the blood pressure machine malfunctioned, she countered with a small smile. Twice. A chuckle escaped him, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise them both. I reviewed your file, you know. Your work with the children's ward, your volunteer hours at the free clinic. The world has given you every reason to become bitter, yet you keep trying to help others. Just as you continue to build and invest in this town, despite how they treat you, Lawrence observed. The new pediatric wing isn't just about appearances, is it? Nolan set his glass aside, leaning forward slightly. When I was at my lowest point, after everything, I swore I'd never let anyone close again. It was easier to be feared than to risk being hurt. But watching you these past weeks, seeing how you face their prejudice with grace. He paused, struggling with words that had gone unspoken for too long. You don't have to explain, Lawrence said gently. I understand what it's like to build walls around your heart, to convince yourself that it's safer to be alone. The grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the study. Outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping the world in silence. But inside this room, something was shifting, years of carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble. Would you like to hear a story? Nolan asked suddenly. The real story, not the version this town has twisted into gossip. It's not a pleasant tale, especially for Christmas Eve, but I would, Lawrence replied, her voice warm with understanding. And perhaps, if you're willing to listen, I have a story of my own to share. As the party continued in the grand hall beyond, two souls branded by society's judgments began to share their truths. The fire burned low, casting dancing shadows on the walls as tales of betrayal, loss, and survival unfolded. With each word spoken, each quiet confession, the distance between them diminished. In that book-lined study, on a snowy Christmas Eve, the man everyone feared and the woman nobody understood began to see each other clearly for the first time. Their stories, though different in detail, shared the same core of pain and resilience, and perhaps, in the sharing of these wounds, something new began to heal. Hours passed unnoticed as they talked, their conversation flowing more freely with each passing moment. When Lawrence finally glanced at the clock, she was startled to find it was nearly 3 a.m. The sounds of the party had long since faded, leaving them in a peaceful cocoon of understanding. I should go, she said reluctantly, rising from her chair. The morning shift at the hospital. Nolan stood as well, his movement quick, almost urgent. Have dinner with me, he said, then added more softly. Please. There's so much more I want to talk about to understand. Lawrence looked at him, really looked, seeing past the harsh exterior to the man beneath, a man who, like her, had been shaped by pain, but not destroyed by it. Yes, she replied simply. I'd like that. As he walked her to the door, their steps matched in perfect rhythm. The grand hall was empty now, the decorations and remnants of the party creating a dreamlike atmosphere. At the entrance, Snowflakes swirled in as Nolan opened the door, a few landing in Lawrence's dark hair like stars. "Merry Christmas, Nurse Blacksmith," he said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that would have shocked anyone else in Millbrook. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Miles," she replied, her smile genuine and unguarded. As Lawrence walked home through the silent, snow-covered streets, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. And in his massive, empty house, Nolan Miles stood at the window, watching her figure disappear into the night, realizing that for the first time since that other Christmas Eve so long ago, his heart felt lighter. Neither of them could know that this night would become legend in Millbrook, the Christmas Eve when two of the town's most misunderstood souls found in each other something worth risking their carefully guarded hearts for. But they both felt it. The quiet certainty that something extraordinary had begun in that firelit study, something that would change not only their lives, but the very fabric of their small town forever. Chapter 4. The Truth Behind the Mask. The private dining room at Le Jardin cast intimate shadows across the white tablecloth, candlelight dancing off crystal glasses. 3 weeks had passed since Christmas Eve, and Nolan and Lawrence had fallen into a comfortable routine of evening meetings, each one peeling back another layer of their carefully constructed facades. Tonight was different. Nolan had been unusually quiet, his fingers drumming an anxious rhythm on the stem of his wineglass. Lawrence noticed how he'd barely touched his food, how his usual confident posture seemed brittle, like glass about to shatter. "Do you believe in redemption, Lawrence?" he asked suddenly, using her first name as he'd begun doing recently. The word felt intimate in the quiet room, carrying weight beyond its syllables. She set down her fork, giving him her full attention. Over their weeks of dinners and long conversations, she'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his voice changed when approaching difficult topics. "I believe we're more than our worst moments," she answered carefully, "or what others believe about us." Nolan's laugh held no humor, even when those beliefs are based on truth, when the monster they see is one you created yourself. "Tell me," she said simply, reaching across the table to still his restless fingers with her own. His hand was warm beneath hers, and she felt the slight tremor he was trying to hide. He took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on their joined hands. "You know parts of it already, the broad strokes I shared on Christmas Eve. But the details?" He withdrew his hand, running it through his immaculate hair in an uncharacteristically nervous gesture. "The details are harder to face. I met Daisy Cornwall during my second year of college," he began, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I was 19, heir to my father's business empire, and completely unprepared for someone like her. She was incandescent, the kind of beautiful that makes you forget to breathe." Lawrence watched as the memories played across his face, years of pain rising to the surface. She was new money. Her father had struck it rich in tech stocks, but she played the role of the poor scholarship student perfectly, said she was working her way through school, that her family had lost everything. And I, fool that I was, fell for every word. He stood abruptly, moving to the window that overlooked Millbrook's main street. I wanted to be her knight in shining armor. Every tear she shed over bills she couldn't pay, every sad story about having to choose between textbooks and food, I threw money at all of it. Expensive gifts, paid her rent, even bought her a car. "Your father didn't approve," Lawrence said softly, remembering fragments of their Christmas Eve conversation. "He tried to warn me, said he'd had her background checked, that things weren't adding up. I accused him of being elitist, of not wanting his son to date someone he saw as beneath us." Nolan's reflection in the window showed a bitter smile. "The irony is, she was playing me precisely because of my family's money. She and her boyfriend had it planned from the start. The man from the Christmas party," Lorenz pieced together, rising to join him at the window. James Huntington. Nolan spat the name like poison. Old money, old connections. He and Daisy had been together for years. I was just entertainment, a way to fund their lifestyle while they laughed behind my back. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. When my father cut off my access to the family accounts, tried to force me to see reason, I started stealing. Small amounts at first, then larger sums. I told myself it was true love, that I was fighting against a world that didn't understand us. Lorenz stayed silent, offering the gift of her presence as he continued. The Christmas Eve party was their grand finale. Daisy had insisted I come, even though we'd been fighting about money. Said she had a special surprise for me. His voice cracked slightly. The surprise was finding them together, deliberately ensuring I walked in at the worst possible moment. But that wasn't enough. They had to twist the knife. He turned to face Lorenz, his eyes haunted. They'd filmed everything. Not just that night, but all of it. My pathetic declarations of love, the times I'd stolen money for her, my tantrums at my father. They threatened to release it all unless I signed over my trust fund to them. But you didn't, Lorenz said quietly, seeing the pieces fall into place. Number Y walked out into the snow and kept walking. Ended up in a homeless shelter on Christmas Day. His laugh was harsh. My father would have helped if I'd asked, but my pride wouldn't let me. I spent 6 months on the streets, working whatever jobs I could find, before I finally swallowed my pride and called him. Nolan moved back to the table, pouring himself another glass of wine with slightly shaking hands. He gave me a choice: come back to the family business and learn from the ground up, or stay on my own. I chose to work, spent 5 years rebuilding my reputation, learning every aspect of the business. When he retired, he gave me full control. And Daisy, Lorenz asked gently. Their scheme fell apart when they tried it on someone else. James abandoned her when the money ran out. Last I heard, she was... He paused, pain flickering across his features. She didn't survive her demons. But by then, I'd already become what you see, the terrible man everyone fears. It was easier than risking being that foolish boy again. Lorenz moved closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. The boy who believed in love wasn't foolish, Nolan. And the man who survived hasn't become the monster he thinks he is. He turned to her, vulnerability raw in his expression. How can you be so sure? Because monsters don't build children's hospitals, she said softly. They don't keep employing people who fear them, or host fundraisers for the community that shuns them. And they certainly don't spend weeks having dinner with the town's unluckiest nurse, listening to her stories and sharing their own. Nolan's breath caught as she reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his cheek. The mask you wear, the terrible man, the heartless businessman, I see through it, just as you see through mine. For a long moment they stood in silence, the truth of their connection humming in the space between them. Then, slowly, like ice melting in spring, Nolan's rigid posture softened. His hand came up to cover hers where it rested against his face. "How do you do that?" he whispered. "How do you look at all the darkness and still see light?" "Because I had to learn to find light in the darkest places," she answered simply. "And because sometimes the people who seem the most broken are actually the strongest. They've just forgotten how to let others see their strength." The candle on their table flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, Millbrook continued its evening routines, unaware that in this quiet room, 2 souls branded by pain were finding their way toward healing. "Thank you," Nolan said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "For listening, for understanding, for seeing me." Lorenz smiled, the warmth of it reaching her eyes. Thank you for trusting me with your truth." As they sat back down to their now cold dinner, something had shifted between them. The masks they'd worn for so long had cracked, revealing not the monsters they'd feared, but two hearts capable of extraordinary resilience, and perhaps, if they were brave enough to try, extraordinary love. Chapter 5. Young Love's Bitter Lesson. 7 years ago, Stirling University. The autumn leaves scattered across Stirling University's cobblestone paths as 19-year-old Nolan Miles hurried across campus. His designer backpack bounced against his shoulder, filled with business textbooks he'd barely opened. These days, his mind was occupied with thoughts far removed from corporate finance and market analysis. "Nolan!" a melodic voice called out, stopping him in his tracks. Daisy Cornwall stood beneath a maple tree, golden leaves falling around her like nature's own spotlight. Her honey-blonde hair caught the sunlight, and her blue eyes sparkled with what he thought was joy at seeing him. "I was just thinking about you," she said, moving closer. The scent of her expensive perfume, a gift he'd given her last week, wrapped around him like a spell. "I missed you in economics." "Had a meeting with my father," Nolan replied, already reaching for his wallet. "Is everything okay? You seem worried." Daisy's perfect lips trembled slightly. "It's nothing. Just the rent is due, and my scholarship payment is delayed again. But I'll figure something out. Maybe I can pick up extra shifts at the coffee shop." Nolan's heart clenched at her obvious distress. "Here," he said, pulling out several $100 bills. "Take this. I don't want you working yourself to exhaustion." "Oh no, I couldn't," Daisy protested, but her fingers were already closing around the money. "You're too good to me, Nolan. I don't deserve you." If he hadn't been so blinded by love, he might have noticed how smoothly she slipped the cash into her designer purse, a purse she'd claimed was a lucky find at a thrift store. He might have questioned why her supposedly delayed scholarship never seemed to affect her ability to wear the latest fashions or maintain her perfect manicure. Later that evening, in his luxury apartment off campus, Daisy curled against him on his leather couch. "Tell me again about your family's company," she murmured, tracing patterns on his chest. "It sounds so exciting." "Dad wants me to start from the bottom when I graduate," Nolan said, playing with her silky hair. "Says I need to earn my place, not just inherit it." "That's so unfair." Daisy sat up, indignation flashing in her eyes. "You're his son. Everything he has should be yours, too." "He's just old-fashioned, wants me to understand the value of hard work." Nolan kissed her forehead, missing the calculating look that crossed her face. "Speaking of which, he's been asking questions about you. Maybe you could join us for dinner next week?" A flash of something. Panic? Crossed Daisy's features before she smoothed them into a worried frown. "I don't think that's a good idea. Rich men like your father, they never understand people like me. From the wrong side of the tracks." "He'll love you," Nolan insisted. "Once he sees how special you are." "Please," she cut him off, tears welling in her eyes. "I couldn't bear it if he looked down on me, made you see me differently." Young Nolan pulled her close, promising to protect her from anything that might cause her pain. He didn't see how she rolled her eyes over his shoulder, didn't notice the text message lighting up her phone. "Everything on schedule. The trust fund baby is completely hooked." The weeks turned into months. Every time Daisy needed money, for textbooks, for car repairs, for medical bills, Nolan provided it without question. When his father began restricting his access to the family accounts, he started small thefts from the company, justifying each one as necessary for love. "Son, we need to talk," Richard Miles said one evening, his office overlooking the city lights. "I've had Miss Cornwall investigated." "You what?" Nolan's face flushed with anger. "How dare you? She's not who she claims to be." His father pushed a folder across the desk. "Her father is Marcus Cornwall, the tech millionaire. She has her own trust fund, larger than yours, and she has a boyfriend, James Huntington." Lies. Nolan swept the folder to the floor, documents scattering. "You're just trying to control me, like always. You can't stand that I found someone who loves me for me, not for the Miles name. Nolan, please!" But he was already storming out, slamming the heavy oak door behind him. That night, he transferred another $10,000 from the company accounts to his personal one, telling himself it was an act of rebellion against his father's interference. The Christmas Eve party invitation arrived 2 weeks later, elegant cream cardstock with gold lettering. A special surprise, Daisy had promised when she handed it to him. Something that will change everything. The Huntington mansion blazed with lights, holiday music spilling out into the snow-covered grounds. Nolan arrived late, having spent hours arguing with his father about another suspicious transfer of funds. He'd had to sweet-talk the bank manager to avoid questions, but it was worth it. Tonight, he would prove to everyone that his love for Daisy was real. The party was in full swing, champagne flowing freely as the children of privilege celebrated the holiday. Nolan searched the crowded rooms for Daisy, finally spotting a flash of honey-blonde hair disappearing up the grand staircase. "Daisy!" he called out, following. The music faded as he climbed to the second floor. A door stood ajar at the end of the hallway, lamplight spilling onto the thick carpet. What he found inside shattered his world. Daisy was there, wrapped in James Huntington's arms, both of them laughing as they watched something on a laptop screen. As Nolan stepped into the room, he recognized his own voice coming from the speakers. "I'll always take care of you, Daisy. No matter what it costs." "Right on time," James smirked, not bothering to release Daisy. "We've been waiting for you." Didn't he play his part beautifully? Daisy's voice held none of the warmth Nolan had grown to love. So eager to prove his love with Daddy's money. "What ... Nolan's voice cracked. "What is this?" James gestured to the laptop. "This is our insurance policy. Every pathetic declaration of love, every illegal transfer of funds, every moment of you defying your father, all captured for posterity, or should I say for negotiation." Daisy finally stepped away from James, her movement graceful as a cat approaching wounded prey. "It's simple, really. Sign over your trust fund to us, or we release everything. I'm sure the board of Miles Enterprises would be very interested in seeing how their future CEO handles company finances." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Nolan stared at the woman he'd thought he loved, seeing for the first time the cruel twist of her perfect lips, the cold calculation in her eyes. "How long?" he managed to ask. "Was any of it real?" "Oh, darling." Daisy's laugh was like broken glass. "You were a job. A rather easy one, actually. James and I have been together for years. You were just entertainment. And funding. The scholarship story?" His voice sounded distant to his own ears. "Please." She rolled her eyes. "My trust fund makes yours look like pocket change, but it was locked until I turned 25, and we had expenses. You were just so convenient." James stepped forward, holding out a stack of papers. "Now, about that trust fund transfer." But Nolan was already moving, stumbling backward out of the room. Their laughter followed him down the stairs, through the party where guests stared at his wild eyes and pale face, out into the snow that was beginning to fall. He walked for hours that night, the temperature dropping with each step. His expensive coat offered little protection against the winter wind, but he barely felt it. By morning, he found himself at a homeless shelter, too proud to call his father, too broken to face the world he'd known. The lesson had been brutal. Love was a weapon, trust was for fools, and the only way to protect yourself was to become someone no one would dare to hurt again. In that shelter on Christmas morning, the foundations of terrible Miles began to take shape. But now, 7 years later, sitting across from Lawrence in Le Jardin, Nolan realized something he'd missed in all those years of building his walls. Sometimes the greatest strength isn't in becoming untouchable, but in finding someone worth trusting again, someone whose own scars matched yours, who saw past the armor to the wounds beneath. As Lawrence reached across the table to take his hand, Nolan felt something he hadn't experienced since that snowy night. Hope. Perhaps young love's bitter lesson hadn't been the end of his story, but merely the beginning of a path that led him here, to this moment, to these understanding eyes that held no judgment, only compassion. "Thank you," he whispered, his fingers tightening around hers, "for making me remember who I was before the mask, and for helping me believe I could be something more than what they made me." Outside the restaurant window, snow began to fall, but this time it didn't feel like an ending. This time, it felt like the start of something new. Chapter 6, The Fall from Grace. 7 years ago, the days after Christmas. The St. Martin's homeless shelter smelled of industrial cleaner and desperation. Nolan Miles sat on a thin mattress, his once immaculate suit wrinkled and stained, his hands raw from the cold. 3 days had passed since he'd walked out of the Huntington mansion, since his world had shattered into unrecognizable pieces. "Eat something, son," urged Sister Margaret, placing a bowl of soup beside him. She'd watched him arrive on Christmas morning, this broken young man in expensive clothes who flinched at kindness. "Whatever brought you here, starving yourself won't fix it." Nolan stared at his reflection in the soup's surface, barely recognizing himself. His phone had died days ago. Not that it mattered. The only calls would be from his father, and pride wouldn't let him answer them, not after everything. "They're probably watching the shelter," he muttered, paranoia creeping in. Would Daisy and James release the videos anyway? Would the police come for him over the stolen money? Each creak of the shelter's old floors made him jump, expecting judgment to finally find him. The first week passed in a blur of sleepless nights and uneaten meals. Other shelter residents gave him wide berth, recognizing the dangerous mix of shame and rage that radiated from him. He spent hours writing in a cheap notebook, documenting every manipulation, every lie, every moment he should have seen through Daisy's act. January 15th. "We're not running a hotel," the new shelter manager informed him. 2-week maximum stay unless you're in the work program. That night, Nolan found himself in a dim coffee shop, counting the loose change he'd found in his coat pockets. The barista, young, pretty, reminding him painfully of Daisy, smiled as she took his order. "Rough times?" she asked kindly. His response was a glare so cold it made her step back. "Keep your pity," he snapped. "Just make the coffee." It was the first spark of his transformation. The realization that anger felt better than pain, that fear in others' eyes meant they couldn't get close enough to hurt you. February. The warehouse job paid cash under the table. 10 hours of loading trucks left his hands blistered and his designer shoes ruined, but it meant a bed at the downtown boarding house. His roommate, an ex-con named Marcus, taught him street survival between shifts. "You're too soft," Marcus observed, watching Nolan count his meager earnings. "Rich boy like you, world's gonna eat you alive unless you grow some teeth." That night, Nolan caught his reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. "Grow some teeth," he whispered to himself. The next day, he used his first paycheck to buy a second-hand suit. It wasn't designer, but it was armor. March. The first business deal came through Marcus. A failing garage, its owner desperate for cash. Nolan recognized the potential immediately. Prime location, good equipment, just poor management. He spent 3 days writing a business plan in his boarding house room, then walked into Millbrook National Bank. "Mr. Miles," the manager stammered, recognizing him despite his changed appearance. We've been trying to reach your father." "This isn't about my father," Nolan cut him off, his voice carrying a new edge. "This is about opportunity. You can either be part of it or watch someone else profit. He walked out with a loan, secured against future holdings he technically didn't have yet. The desperate garage owner sold for a fraction of the property's worth. Within 2 months, Nolan had renovated and resold it for triple the investment. April. The boarding house became a small apartment. One successful deal led to another. Nolan developed a reputation, brilliant but ruthless, showing no mercy in negotiations. His father's investigators finally found him, but he sent them away with a message. "Tell him I'm building my own empire." Each success hardened him further. The pain of betrayal transformed into a weapon, teaching him to spot weakness in others and exploit it mercilessly. The kind young man who had once given away money freely became someone who saw every interaction as a transaction to be won. May. "You've changed," Marcus said over beers in a dive bar. "That soft, rich kid who showed up at the warehouse, he's gone." Nolan adjusted his new custom-made suit, a mirror of the ones he'd once worn thoughtlessly. He was weak. The world taught him better. But in the quiet hours before dawn, alone in his apartment, sometimes the mask slipped. He'd dream of honey-blonde hair and cruel laughter, wake up reaching for someone who had never really existed. Those moments of vulnerability made him push harder, build his walls higher. June. The call to his father's office was brief. "I'm ready to come back," Nolan said, his voice carrying none of the emotion that had once characterized their conversation. "But on my terms." Richard Miles studied his son across the mahogany desk, noting the changes 6 months had carved into him. Gone was the passionate boy who'd stormed out on Christmas Eve. In his place sat a calculating stranger with eyes like winter. "The board needs to see you're serious," Richard said carefully. "They're concerned about stability." Nolan's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then let me prove it. Give me the Wilson account." The Wilson account, a failing manufacturing company that had been with Miles Enterprises for generations. Within a week, Nolan had orchestrated a hostile takeover, stripped the assets, and turned a massive profit. He ignored the human cost, the generations of workers left jobless. Compassion was a luxury he could no longer afford. Present day, Millbrook. That first year was the hardest, Nolan told Lawrence as they walked through the snowy park. Building terrible Miles piece by piece, decision by decision. Each time I closed a deal, fired an employee, or crushed a competitor, it felt like burning another bridge to who I used to be. Lawrence's gloved hand tightened around his. "But you kept something of that person," she observed. "The pediatric wing, the charity foundations. Those aren't the actions of someone completely lost to darkness." Nolan stopped walking, looking out over the frozen pond where children played. "Maybe that's what scared me most about meeting you. You saw past the mask I'd spent years perfecting, made me question if all that armor was protecting me or imprisoning me." "Strength isn't always about being untouchable," Lawrence said softly. "Sometimes it's about being brave enough to risk being touched again." A snowball hit a nearby tree, children's laughter carrying across the park. Nolan watched them play, remembering the young man who had walked out into a different snowy night 7 years ago. "The fall from grace," he mused. "Everyone focuses on the falling part. Nobody talks about what happens after you hit bottom, how you either stay there or build something new from the wreckage." "And what are you building now?" Lawrence asked, her dark eyes holding his. For the first time in 7 years, Nolan felt the walls he'd built beginning to crack, not in weakness, but in the way ice breaks in spring, making way for new growth. "Something different," he answered, his free hand coming up to brush snow from her cheek. "Something real." As they continued their walk, the setting sun painted the snow in shades of gold and purple. The man everyone called terrible, felt anything but terrible, walking hand in hand with someone who understood that sometimes the greatest falls lead to the most important rises. Not back to what was lost, but forward to something unexpected and perhaps even more precious. Chapter 7. A Childhood of Shadows. The winter evening wrapped around Nolan's study like a thick blanket, snow falling softly outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. Laurence sat in what had become her favorite armchair, a cup of tea growing cold in her hands as she prepared to share her own story of loss and resilience. "I remember everything about that last morning with my mother," she began, her voice soft but steady. "The smell of cinnamon from her famous pancakes, the sound of her humming gospel songs while she braided my hair. I was 6, but some memories burn themselves into your soul. 21 years ago. The kitchen in the small blacksmith house was filled with morning sunlight and the scent of breakfast. Marie Blacksmith stood at the stove, her dark hands moving with practiced grace as she flipped perfect circles of golden pancakes. Her daughter Laurence sat at the worn kitchen table, swinging her legs as she watched her mother work. "Mama, can we put chocolate chips in mine?" young Laurence asked, her braids still slightly crooked from sleeping. Marie turned, her smile lighting up her whole face. "Baby girl, you know chocolate chip pancakes are for special occasions." "But today feels special," Laurence insisted with a child's certainty. Her mother's laugh was like music. "Everything feels special to you, sweet girl. That's your gift. Seeing magic in ordinary moments." Neither of them knew it would be their last breakfast together. By afternoon, Marie Blacksmith would collapse at her job at the local diner, an undiagnosed heart condition stealing her away in seconds. The last words she'd said to her daughter were, "Be brave, baby girl. The world needs your light." "I didn't understand what was happening," Laurence told Nolan, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup. "Dad came to get me from school early, which had never happened before. He was crying, and my father never cried. That's when I knew something had broken in our world that could never be fixed." The first year after Marie's death passed in a blur of casseroles from neighbors and awkward condolences. James Blacksmith did his best, but a grieving father could only do so much for a daughter who was a constant reminder of his lost wife. "He started staying later at work," Laurence continued. "I learned to take care of myself, making sandwiches for dinner, doing my homework alone, tucking myself into bed. I was 7, but I felt ancient." The change. When Regina entered their lives, she came like a storm, beautiful, commanding, and destructive. She married James Blacksmith 18 months after Marie's death, bringing designer clothes and sharp opinions into their modest home. "The first thing she did was take down all of Mum's pictures," Laurence recalled, pain flickering across her face. "Said it wasn't healthy to live in the past." Dad didn't argue. He never argued with her about anything. Young Laurence learned quickly to make herself scarce, to move silently through the house like a shadow. But there was no hiding from Regina's critical eyes. "Your hair is a mess," she would say, yanking a brush through Laurence's thick curls. "And look at your skin. You're as dark as soil. At least try to act refined, since we can't do anything about your appearance." The chores began gradually, first helping with dishes, then taking on more and more household tasks. By age 9, Laurence was cooking, cleaning, and doing laundry, while Regina spent her days at shopping clubs and charity luncheons. "The worst part wasn't the work," Laurence explained, her voice steady despite the pain in her words. "It was how she would tell everyone what a burden I was, how gracious she was to raise another woman's child, especially one so difficult." The incidents. They started small, a broken vase that Laurence was blamed for, though she hadn't been in the room, a missing necklace that mysteriously appeared in her school bag. Each incident added to Regina's narrative of the troublesome stepdaughter, the bad seed. She was clever about it, Lorenz said, meeting Nolan's intense gaze. Nothing too obvious, nothing that would raise alarms. Just a steady drip of accidents and misunderstandings that painted me as clumsy at best, malicious at worst, the neighbors began to whisper. Children at school moved away when Lawrence approached, their parents having heard Regina's careful suggestions about her difficult nature and concerning behaviors. Bad luck follows that child, they would say, not quite quietly enough. Did you hear what happened at the school bake sale? Or that incident with the pastor's car? The breaking point. James Blacksmith's death came suddenly, a car accident on a rainy night. Lawrence, 14 and already wise beyond her years, knew something had changed irrevocably when Regina returned from the hospital alone. "He asked for you," Regina said, her voice honey-sweet with poison. "Right before the end, said he was sorry he couldn't protect you better. Imagine that. His last thoughts were about what a burden you've been." That night, as rain pounded against the windows, Regina finally showed her true face. "This house is mine now," she announced, dropping a small bag at Lorenz's feet. "I've tolerated you for his sake, but that obligation ended with him. You have 10 minutes to get out." I remember standing there, holding the bag she'd packed, one change of clothes, no money, no pictures, nothing of my mother's. Lawrence told Nolan, her composure finally cracking slightly. I asked her why she hated me so much. She said, "Hate requires effort, dear. You're simply an inconvenience I no longer have to bear." The streets. The first night on the streets, Lawrence found shelter in a church doorway, wrapped in her father's old sweater that she'd been wearing when Regina threw her out. Rain soaked through her clothes, but she didn't cry. She had promised her mother to be brave, to keep her light burning. "Those first months taught me more about humanity than all the years since," she said softly. "I learned that kindness often comes from those who have the least to give, like the homeless woman who shared her blanket, or the diner cook who would leave day-old food in the alley for me." She learned to survive, finding shelter in libraries during the day, studying whenever she could, doing odd jobs for food money. The label of bad luck followed her, but she turned it into armor, learning to expect rejection so it would hurt less when it came. Present day. "So you see," Lawrence concluded, finally meeting Nolan's eyes again, "when people call me unlucky, when they blame me for everything that goes wrong, it's nothing new. I learned early that the world often needs someone to blame, and it's easiest to blame those who are already marked as different." Nolan moved from his chair, kneeling before her and taking her hands in his. "You were just a child," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "A child who deserved love, not cruelty." "We all deserve love," Lawrence replied gently. "Even terrible men who build walls around their hearts. Even unlucky girls who learn to live in shadows." The snow continued to fall outside, but in the warm study, two souls who had learned to survive in darkness were discovering that sometimes the deepest shadows are where the brightest lights begin to shine. "Your mother was right," Nolan said softly, reaching up to brush a tear from her cheek. "The world does need your light. I think perhaps I needed it most of all." Lorentz smiled through her tears, remembering the little girl who once saw magic in ordinary moments. Perhaps she hadn't lost that gift after all. She had just been waiting to share it with someone who understood that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the darkest places. Chapter 8. The Night That Changed Everything. Snow fell like stardust over Millbrook as Christmas Eve settled its gentle mantle over the town. The Miles mansion blazed with warmth, golden light spilling from every window, a stark contrast to its usual brooding darkness. Inside the grand ballroom, the hospital's annual fundraiser was in full swing, but two souls were about to find their own private universe away from the glittering crowd. Lorentz stood at the edge of the party, her burgundy dress a splash of rich color against the cream-colored walls. She watched Nolan across the room, noting how others instinctively stepped back as he passed. His black suit set him apart from the festive attire of the other guests, like a shadow among butterflies. But she saw something else, the slight tension in his shoulders, the carefully controlled movements that spoke of armor worn too long. Their eyes met across the crowded space, and for a moment the noise of the party faded away. Nolan moved through the crowd with purpose, his expression softening almost imperceptibly as he approached. "Walk with me?" he asked quietly, offering his arm. The simple gesture carried weight. Terrible Miles never showed such courtesies to anyone. She placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, feeling the fine wool of his suit beneath her fingers. "Lead the way." They moved through the mansion's corridors, the sounds of the party growing distant. Nolan guided her to his private study, a sanctuary of leather and wood, where a fire cast dancing shadows on walls lined with books. But instead of taking his usual position behind the massive desk, he moved to stand by the windows, watching the falling snow. "Do you believe in second chances, Lawrence?" he asked, his voice carrying an undertone she'd never heard before, vulnerability. She moved to stand beside him, their reflections ghostly in the window glass. "I believe in the courage it takes to want one." He turned to her then, and in the firelight she saw the cracks in his carefully maintained facade. 7 years ago tonight, I walked out of a Christmas party believing love was nothing but a weapon. Built walls so high I almost forgot what it felt like to breathe freely behind them. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out to touch her face. "And then you walked into my life, seeing through every defense like they were made of glass." Lorenz leaned into his touch, her own barriers wavering. "We recognize our own kind," she whispered, "those of us who've learned to turn pain into armor, loneliness into strength." "You were the first person in years who didn't flinch from my anger," he said, thumb brushing her cheekbone. "The first who looked at me and saw not the monster I'd become, but the man I'd tried to bury." "And you were the first who saw beyond my supposed bad luck," she replied, reaching up to cover his hand with her own. "Who understood that sometimes what others call misfortune is really just the weight of their own prejudices." The fire crackled softly, casting warm light across their features as they stood close enough to share breath. Outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping the world in silence and possibility. "I've spent so long being afraid," Nolan confessed, his voice rough with emotion. "Not of being hurt. I'd survived that. But of wanting something real again. Something that couldn't be bought or controlled or predicted." "Something like this?" Lorenz asked softly, sliding her hand up to rest over his heart. "Exactly like this." His free hand came up to frame her face, eyes searching hers. "You make me want to tear down every wall I've built, and it terrifies me how right that feels." Tears gathered in Lawrence's eyes, but they were tears of recognition, of finding home in another's understanding. "My mother used to say that the bravest thing we can do is let ourselves be seen, really seen, by another soul." "I see you, Lawrence Blacksmith," Nolan whispered, his forehead touching hers. "The strength it took to survive being cast out, the courage to keep your heart open despite everything, the woman who faces each day with grace, no matter how many times the world tries to break her spirit." "And I see you, Nolan Miles," she breathed back. "Not the terrible man they fear, but the boy who loved too deeply, the man who built an empire from his pain, and someone brave enough to consider letting those walls down again." The space between them disappeared as their lips met. A kiss that tasted of healing and hope, and the kind of magic that happens when two broken pieces find their perfect match. It wasn't a kiss of passion or desperation, but of recognition, souls finding their way home. When they parted, Both had tears on their cheeks, but neither moved to wipe them away. Some moments deserve their honest emotion. "Stay," Nolan whispered against her hair. "Not for anything but this. Just being here, being real, watching the snow fall and talking until dawn. Let me learn who you are behind your shields while I find the courage to lower mine." Lorenz smiled, her hands resting against his chest, where his heart beat strong and steady. "Yes," she said simply, the word carrying the weight of new beginnings. They moved to the comfortable sofa near the fire, bodies aligned but not entwined, maintaining the delicate balance of their newfound truth. As Christmas Eve deepened into Christmas morning, they shared stories, not just of pain and loss, but of dreams half-remembered, of small victories and quiet hopes, of the people they were before the world taught them to be afraid. The mansion's grand clock struck midnight, its chimes echoing through the quiet halls. In the study, Millbrook's most feared man and its unluckiest woman had found something neither had dared to hope for. Understanding that went beyond sympathy, strength that didn't require armor, and love that began not with grand passion, but with the simple, profound relief of being truly seen. Dawn found them still talking, their hands intertwined, watching as the world turned pearl and gold with the first light of Christmas. Neither spoke of tomorrow or what would come next. Some moments deserve to exist in their own perfect bubble of time, unmarred by practical concerns or future fears. This was such a moment, a fresh page in both their stories, written not in shadows or fear, but in the quiet light of mutual understanding and newfound hope. And as the sun rose over Millbrook, painting the snow-covered town in shades of promise, something else was rising too. The certainty that sometimes the deepest wounds lead us to our greatest healing, and that love, real love, begins not with perfect hearts, but with the courage to share our broken pieces with someone who understands exactly how they fit together. Chapter 9. A Proposal Born of Understanding. The winter evening wrapped Millbrook in a blanket of pristine snow, the kind that muffles all sound and makes the world feel new. In the children's ward of Millbrook General Hospital, Lawrence was finishing her shift, reading to a young patient named Maya, who was fighting leukemia. Her soft voice carried the story of a princess who found strength in her supposed curses, while Nolan stood unseen in the doorway, watching the scene with eyes full of emotion. 3 months had passed since that transformative Christmas Eve. 3 months of quiet dinners, long conversations, and walls carefully dismantled brick by brick. 3 months of healing and understanding that had changed them both in ways neither had expected. "Nurse Lorenz makes the scary things better," Maya told her mother after the story ended, her small face bright despite her illness. "She says sometimes the things that make us different are really our superpowers in disguise." Nolan's heart tightened in his chest. How many times had he seen this now? The way Lorenz took what others called her curse, her supposed bad luck, and transformed it into a gift of understanding for those who needed it most. "Ready to go?" he asked softly when Lorenz emerged from the room. She smiled at him, the kind of smile that still made his carefully rebuilt world tilt on its axis. "Just let me change," she replied, squeezing his hand as she passed. While he waited, Nolan touched the small box in his coat pocket. Not a diamond. They were beyond such conventional symbols. Instead, it held something far more precious, something that spoke to the unique understanding they shared. He drove them to the park, where they'd walked so many times over the past months, sharing stories and slowly learning to trust again. The snow crunched beneath their feet as they followed the lamp-lit path to the frozen pond where children had skated earlier in the day. "You're quiet tonight," Lawrence observed, her hand warm in his despite the cold. "I've been thinking about transformations," he replied, leading her to a bench they'd cleared of snow. "About how sometimes the things that break us can also rebuild us, if we're brave enough to let them." She studied his face in the soft light of the park lamps, seeing past the mask of terrible Miles to the man beneath. The man she'd grown to love, not despite his scars, but because of how they'd shaped him. "What's on your mind, Nolan?" she asked gently. He took both her hands in his, turning to face her fully. "Do you remember what you told me that first night in my study? About how walls can have doors?" She nodded, her dark eyes soft with memory. "I've spent 7 years building walls so high I almost forgot what it felt like to breathe," he continued, his voice rough with emotion. "Convinced myself that being feared was better than being vulnerable. And then you walked into my life with your quiet strength and unflinching gaze. And suddenly those walls felt more like a prison than protection." Nolan reached into his pocket, withdrawing not a velvet box, but a small, worn leather journal. "This was where I wrote everything during those months on the streets, every bit of pain, every promise to never be weak again." He placed it in her hands. "I want you to have it." Lawrence's fingers trembled as she opened the journal, seeing the raw emotions poured onto its pages in younger Nolan's handwriting. "Why?" "Because you're the only person I trust with my whole story. Not just the man I became, but the boy I was, the pain that shaped me." He took a deep breath, his next words coming from a place of complete vulnerability. "I love you, Lawrence Blacksmith, not despite our broken pieces, but because of how perfectly they fit together." Tears gathered in her eyes as he slid from the bench to one knee in the snow. From his pocket came the small box she hadn't noticed before. Inside wasn't a traditional engagement ring, but a pendant, a beautiful glass piece with a crack running through it, filled with gold in the Japanese kintsugi style. "They say broken things mended with gold become more beautiful for having been broken," he said softly. "Like two people who found strength in their scars, who learned that sometimes the deepest wounds lead us to our greatest healing." His voice cracked slightly. "Marry me, Lawrence. Not because I can give you a perfect life. We both know life isn't perfect. Marry me because you understand my shadows, as I understand yours, because you see strength in what others call weakness, because together we've learned that love isn't about being unbroken, but about finding someone who makes our broken pieces beautiful." Lawrence touched the pendant with trembling fingers, tears falling freely now. "The town will talk," she whispered, though her eyes shone with joy. "The terrible man and the unlucky woman." "Let them talk," Nolan replied, rising to take her face in his hands. "We've lived our lives bound by their judgments long enough. Marry me, and let's write our own story. One where curses become blessings, where fear transforms into strength, where love grows strongest in the places that were once broken." "Yes," she breathed, the word carrying all the weight of their shared journey. "Yes to our story. Yes to our beautiful broken pieces. Yes to you." As he slipped the chain around her neck, the gold-filled cracks in the pendant caught the lamplight like stars. Their lips met in a kiss that tasted of tears and joy and the kind of magic that happens when two souls find their perfect match. Snow began to fall again, soft and gentle, as if nature herself was blessing their union. In that moment, they weren't terrible Miles and unlucky Lawrence. They were simply two people who had found in each other's broken places the perfect space to heal, to grow, to love. "My mother always said magic happens in ordinary moments," Lawrence murmured against his chest as they held each other. "There's nothing ordinary about you," Nolan replied, his fingers tracing the golden cracks in her pendant. "Or about us." They stayed in the park long after the snow stopped falling. planning their future not in grand gestures or perfect moments, but in the quiet understanding that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with broken hearts, finding their way home to each other. And somewhere, in the gentle night air, the whispers of the town began to change. The tale of the terrible man and the unlucky woman was transforming into something else, a story of redemption, of healing, of love that sees beauty in the very cracks that others call flaws. A love born not of perfection, but of the perfect understanding that sometimes our deepest wounds lead us to our greatest blessings. Chapter 10. Love's Transformation. Spring came early to Millbrook that year, as if nature herself celebrated the union of Nolan Miles and Lawrence Blacksmith. The mansion on the hill, once a looming symbol of isolation, now blazed with warmth and light. Through its gates flowed a steady stream of visitors, patients from the children's ward, community members seeking help, and even those who had once whispered the harshest judgments. The transformation began subtly at first. People noticed how terrible Miles's sharp edges had softened, how his business decisions now balanced profit with compassion. The man who had once fired employees without hesitation now created programs to help struggling workers, his own experience of homelessness driving him to ensure others never face the same fate. "Did you hear?" Marion Foster whispered to her friend outside the cafe one morning. "The Miles Foundation is opening a shelter for homeless teens, with education programs and everything." Her friend nodded, watching as Nolan and Lorenz walked hand in hand down Main Street. "And did you see how he handled the factory crisis? Found a way to save all those jobs, instead of just selling for profit." The changes in Lawrence were equally profound. The supposed curse of bad luck that had followed her seemed to transform into something else entirely. Hospital equipment still occasionally malfunctioned around her, but now people noticed how these accidents often led to early detection of problems that might have caused greater harm. "It's the strangest thing," Dr. Thompson remarked during a staff meeting. "That MRI glitch while Nurse Blacksmith was scanning little Tommy. It revealed a tumor we might have missed otherwise. 5th time something like that has happened." The children's ward, once a place of whispered superstitions about her presence, became a center of healing and hope. Young patients asked specifically for Nurse Lawrence, who understood what it meant to be different, to be judged unfairly, and who showed them how to find strength in their struggles. Their wedding in early spring became a symbol of the town's own transformation. The ceremony was held in the mansion's gardens, where winter's last frost melted beneath an unseasonably warm sun. Cherry blossoms bloomed weeks early, carpeting the ground in pink petals as Lawrence walked down the aisle. "I once built walls to keep the world out," Nolan said in his vows, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "But you showed me that real strength isn't in isolation, it's in having the courage to let love in." Lawrence, radiant in a dress that honored both her mother's African heritage and her American upbringing, responded with equal emotion. "People called us cursed, the terrible man, the unlucky woman. But together we've learned that sometimes what others call curses are really just blessings waiting to be understood." The reception that followed broke down the last barriers between the Miles mansion and the town. Children played in gardens that had once been forbidden territory. Former critics danced alongside long-time supporters. The house itself seemed to shed its Gothic gloom, its windows gleaming with welcome rather than warning. But the real transformation happened in the quiet moments, witnessed only by those closest to them, like the night Nolan found Lorenz in his study, crying over a letter. "The children's clinic funding came through," she whispered as he held her. "We can help so many kids who have nowhere else to go." The clinic became their shared passion, a place where children from troubled backgrounds could find medical care, understanding, and hope. Nolan's business acumen, combined with Lawrence's healing touch, created something unprecedented in Millbrook, a sanctuary where being different wasn't a curse, but a source of strength. Their influence spread beyond the town's borders. Other communities began studying the Millbrook model of compassionate business practices and integrated healthcare. Journalists who came to write about the terrible man's redemption found instead a story of how love can transform not just two people, but an entire community. "You've changed this town," Mayor Richardson told them at the clinic's opening ceremony. "Changed how we see ourselves and each other." Nolan squeezed Lawrence's hand. "We just showed them what we learned ourselves. That sometimes the things that seem to break us are really just creating space for something better to grow." The mansion's study, where their story truly began, remained their private sanctuary. But now the room held new memories alongside the old. The chair, where Lawrence first sat on Christmas Eve, became her favorite spot for reading to their adopted daughter, a former patient from the children's ward, whose own story of abandonment and resilience mirrored their own. "Tell me again how you and Papa found each other," little Maya would ask, curled in Lawrence's lap, while Nolan watched from his desk, his heart full. "It's a story about seeing beauty in broken places," Lawrence would begin, touching the golden-veined pendant she still wore, about how sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us to the best parts of our lives. As their love transformed them, it also transformed how Millbrook understood strength and beauty. The terrible man became known for his wisdom and compassion. The unlucky woman's presence was sought out as a blessing in disguise. Their story became legend, not a fairy tale of perfect people finding perfect love, but a true tale of how two wounded souls found healing in each other's broken places. The mansion on the hill still stood as the highest point in Millbrook, but it was no longer a symbol of isolation. Instead, it became a beacon of hope, its lights gleaming in the darkness to guide others home, just as Nolan and Lawrence had guided each other home through their own shadows. Spring turned to summer, and the gardens bloomed with unprecedented vigor. Some said it was Lawrence's supposedly unlucky touch transforming into something miraculous. Others credited Nolan's newfound gentleness with the land he'd once ruled with cold efficiency. But those who knew them best understood the truth. Love doesn't just transform the lovers. It transforms everything it touches, turning curses into blessings, fear into strength, and broken pieces into something more beautiful than perfection could ever be. And in the quiet moments, when the day's work was done and the town settled into evening peace, Nolan and Lawrence would often stand in their study, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors they had once been too wounded to see. "Did you ever imagine this?" she would ask, leaning back against his chest. "No," he would answer honestly, his arms tightening around her. "I imagined survival. You taught me how to live." Their story became more than just a tale of personal redemption. It became a testament to love's power to transform not just hearts, but entire communities. The terrible man and the unlucky woman had become living proof that sometimes the most powerful changes begin in the most unexpected places, in a Christmas Eve conversation, in shared understanding of pain, and in the courage to believe that even the deepest wounds can become channels for extraordinary love. Chapter 11. Justice's Silent Victory. The morning newspaper lay unopened on Nolan's desk, its headlines stark against the cream-colored paper. Daisy Cornwall found dead in hotel room. Lawrence watched her husband's face as he stood by the study window, his reflection a mixture of emotions she had learned to read so well over their time together. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, moving to stand beside him. Nolan's hand found hers, their fingers intertwining automatically. "I thought I'd feel something different," he admitted, Satisfaction, maybe, or vindication. Instead, I just feel sad. Sad for the young woman who threw away her life chasing hollow victories. The story had emerged piece by piece over the past year. After their failed scheme with Nolan, Daisy and James had attempted similar manipulations with other wealthy targets. But James, ever the opportunist, had abandoned her when their last mark turned out to be an undercover investigator looking into financial fraud. She never found her way back, Nolan said quietly, remembering the bright-eyed girl who had first caught his attention all those years ago. Every choice she made took her further into darkness. Lawrence squeezed his hand. Sometimes people get so lost in playing a role that they forget who they really are. The details in the newspaper were clinical: alcohol poisoning, prescription drugs, a lonely death in an expensive hotel room paid for with her last credit card. No family claimed the body. Her father, the tech millionaire, had distanced himself years ago after multiple scandals. James Huntington, when reached for comment, claimed he hadn't spoken to her in years. "I kept tabs on her, you know," Nolan confessed, "not out of any lingering feeling, but because I thought one day she might try to hurt someone else the way she hurt me. I even had opportunities to expose her schemes, to ruin her the way she tried to ruin me." "But you didn't," Lawrence observed, pride in her voice. "No." He turned from the window to face her. "Because you taught me something about real justice. It's not about revenge or punishment. It's about growing beyond the pain, becoming something better than what hurt us." They moved to sit in their familiar spots by the fireplace, where their love story had begun that Christmas Eve. The morning sun painted patterns on the wooden floor, a stark contrast to the somber news they discussed. "Do you remember what you told me about Regina?" Nolan asked, referencing Lawrence's cruel stepmother. "How her own bitterness became her prison." Lawrence nodded, thinking of her own path to understanding. She's still alive, still bitter, still alone. But her power to hurt me died the moment I realized her cruelty said more about her than it ever did about me. Daisy was the same, Nolan reflected. She had everything: money, beauty, opportunities. But she was so focused on taking from others that she never built anything real of her own. In the end, that became her punishment. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. While Daisy had spiraled downward, pursuing scheme after scheme, Nolan and Lawrence had built something beautiful together. The children's clinic thrived, helping kids find hope in their darkest moments. The Miles Foundation had become a force for positive change in the community. Their love had transformed not just their own lives, but the lives of countless others. "There's a letter," Nolan said suddenly, pulling an envelope from his desk drawer. "She sent it 3 months ago. I never opened it." Lawrence watched as he held the envelope, his fingers tracing the expensive paper. "Do you want to read it now?" He considered for a moment, then slowly shook his head. "Whatever justifications or explanations it contains belong to the past. My life isn't there anymore." He placed the unopened letter in the fireplace, watching as the flames consumed it. "You know what the real justice is?" he asked, returning to his seat beside Lawrence. "Not this news, not her sad end. The real justice is that she failed to break me. That instead of becoming bitter and cruel, I found my way to you, to love, to becoming someone who builds rather than destroys." Lawrence touched the golden-veined pendant she always wore, their symbol of beauty in broken places. "That's the thing about real justice," she mused. "It doesn't need to announce itself with fanfare. It works silently in the choices we make every day." From upstairs came the sound of Maya stirring, their adopted daughter beginning her day. Soon she would bound down to the study as she did every morning, bringing light and laughter to chase away any lingering shadows. "Should we tell her?" Lawrence asked softly. "Someday," Nolan replied, "when she's older." not as a story of revenge or justice, but as a lesson about how pain can either break us or transform us, about how the best revenge against cruelty is to become something better than what hurt us. Maya's footsteps pattered down the hallway, and both Nolan and Lorenz turned toward the sound with love in their eyes. This was their real victory, not the sad end of a lost soul, but the beautiful life they had built from the ashes of their pain. The newspaper would be relegated to the recycling bin, its stark headline already fading into history. Daisy's story had ended as it was bound to, not through any action of theirs, but through the natural consequences of her own choices. Meanwhile, their story continued to unfold in moments of joy, in lives touched, in love shared. As Maya burst into the study, her smile bright enough to chase away any lingering melancholy, Nolan and Lorenz exchanged a glance of deep understanding. Justice hadn't come in the form of revenge or punishment, but in the quiet victory of living well, loving deeply, and transforming pain into purpose. The morning sun continued its journey across the study floor, illuminating not the newspaper's sad headline, but the family portrait on the wall, Nolan, Lorenz, and Maya, their smiles genuine, their love real. This was justice in its purest form, the triumph of love over bitterness, of growth over stagnation, of life over the kind of death that begins in the heart long before it claims the body. And as they began their day together, the news of Daisy's fate faded into the background, not forgotten but transcended. In the end, justice had spoken not through vengeance, but through contrast, between a life wasted in pursuit of hollow victories and a life richly lived in pursuit of love, healing, and transformation. Chapter 12. The Power of Second Chances. 5 years had passed since that transformative Christmas Eve. The Miles mansion, once a symbol of isolation, now glowed with warmth on a special summer evening. Fairy lights twinkled in the gardens where dozens of tables had been set for the annual fundraiser for the Children's Hope Clinic, an event that had become the heart of Millbrook's community. Nolan stood at the window of his study, adjusting his tie as he watched guests arrive. The man reflected in the glass barely resembled the terrible Miles of old. His eyes, once cold with defensive anger, now held a warmth that still surprised him sometimes. "Papa!" Maya's voice rang out as she burst into the study, her party dress swirling. At 10 years old, she was the living embodiment of their journey of healing. "Mama says it's almost time for your speech." Lorenz followed their daughter, radiant in a deep blue gown that caught the evening light. The golden-veined pendant still hung at her throat, its cracks filled with precious metal, their eternal symbol of beauty, born from brokenness. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, coming to stand beside him. Her hand found his automatically, their fingers intertwining in the way that had become as natural as breathing. "I've been thinking about second chances," he replied, pulling her close, "about how different this night is from that first Christmas Eve." Through the window they could see the gathering crowd. Former critics now sat alongside longtime supporters. Children from the clinic played with kids from Millbrook's wealthiest families, their laughter carrying up to the study windows. And there, near the fountain, stood a teenage girl who had arrived at their clinic last winter, as lost as Lorenz had once been at 14. "Jessica's mother came to the ceremony today," Lawrence said, following his gaze. "First time she's been sober in 10 years. Said watching her daughter heal at the clinic made her want to heal too." Nolan pressed a kiss to her temple. "You gave them that chance. Your supposed bad luck turned out to be the greatest gift this town could have received." Maya tugged at their hands. "Come on. Everyone's waiting." They descended the grand staircase together, a family built not from perfect pieces, but from perfectly matching broken ones. The great hall, once a place of lonely elegance, now hummed with life and conversation. Pictures lined the walls, newspaper clippings about the clinic's success, photos of families helped, children healed, lives transformed. As they stepped into the garden, a hush fell over the gathered crowd. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, as if nature herself was celebrating with them. Nolan took his place at the podium, his family standing proudly beside him. 5 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the hushed gathering, I stood in this garden and made a vow, not just to my wife, but to myself and this community, a vow to prove that our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts, that our darkest moments can lead us to our brightest light. He paused, looking at Lorenz and Maya, drawing strength from their presence. Many of you knew me as Terrible Miles. Some of you feared my wife's supposed curse of bad luck. But tonight, as we celebrate another year of the Children's Hope Clinic, I want to tell you about the real magic that happens when we dare to believe in second chances. His voice caught slightly as he continued. In this garden, we've seen children who were told they were worthless discover their infinite worth. We've watched families heal wounds that seemed impossible to mend. We've witnessed what happens when a community chooses understanding over fear, love over judgment. Tears glistened in many eyes as he spoke. In the front row, Jessica, the teenage girl they'd taken in last winter, sat with her newly sober mother, their hands clasped tightly. Beside them was Marcus, the ex-con who had taught Nolan street survival, now the clinic's respected security chief. But the greatest miracle, Nolan continued, his own eyes growing moist, isn't in the lives we've helped change. It's in how those changes have transformed us. My wife taught me that sometimes what looks like bad luck is really just life creating space for something beautiful to grow. Our daughter showed us that family isn't about perfect pieces, but about hearts that fit together despite their cracks. Lorenz stepped forward then, taking his hand. And you, she added, addressing the crowd, you taught us that an entire community can learn to see with new eyes, that the labels we give each other, terrible, unlucky, broken, are really just cocoons, waiting for the moment we're brave enough to break free. Maya joined them, wrapping her arms around them both. The sight brought fresh tears to many eyes. The man everyone had feared, the woman they had shunned, and the child who had helped heal them both, standing together as a testament to love's transformative power. So tonight, Nolan concluded, his voice thick with emotion, we celebrate not just the clinic's success, but every second chance that brought us here. Every moment someone chose love over fear, understanding over judgment, hope over despair, because that's the real power of second chances. They don't just change one life, they create ripples that transform entire communities. As applause filled the garden, Lorenz reached up to wipe a tear from his cheek. You did it, she whispered. We did it, he corrected, pulling her and Maya close. All of us. Together. The evening continued with dinner and dancing, stories shared, and new connections made. Children from the clinic performed a song they had written about hope and healing, their young voices carrying into the summer night. Former patients spoke about their journeys, each story a testament to the power of belief in second chances. Later, as the celebration wound down, Nolan and Lawrence found themselves back in their study, the room where their story had begun. Maya had fallen asleep on the sofa, her face peaceful in the soft lamplight. Do you ever wonder, Lorenz asked softly, what would have happened if we hadn't been brave enough to trust again? Nolan drew her close, breathing in the scent of her hair. I think love like ours was inevitable, he replied. Some souls are just meant to find each other, to heal each other. All we had to do was be brave enough to recognize it when it came. Through the window, the last guests were leaving, carrying with them not just memories of a beautiful evening, but the living proof that second chances aren't just about starting over. They're about becoming something more beautiful than we ever imagined possible. Mama, Maya stirred sleepily. Tell me again how you and Papa found each other. Lorenz smiled through happy tears, settling beside their daughter. It's a story about second chances, sweet girl. About how sometimes the things that seem to break us are really just creating space for love to find its way in. As Nolan watched his wife and daughter, their heads bent together in the soft light, he felt the full weight of their journey. From the broken young man who had walked out into a snowy Christmas Eve, to the terrible businessman feared by all, to this moment of pure joy, every step, even the painful ones, had led him here. And in the quiet of their study, surrounded by the love that had transformed not just their lives, but an entire community, Nolan and Lorenz shared a look of perfect understanding. Their story wasn't just about second chances. It was about the miracle that happens when two supposedly broken people discover that their cracks and scars make them perfectly suited to heal each other. Outside, stars began to appear in the summer sky, each one a point of light in the darkness, just as each healed heart in their community had become a beacon of hope for others. The terrible man and the unlucky woman had become living proof that love doesn't just heal, it transforms, it rebuilds, it creates something more beautiful than perfection could ever be. And in that moment, surrounded by the family and life they had built together, they knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as our deepest wounds. And the most powerful love stories begin not with perfect people, but with those brave enough to believe in second chances. Subscribe if liked.